This is Fermatina. It's a demo for Fermata, a game I'm developing, and it's probably the culmination of my several years of game development. But how did we get here? We'd need to go all the way back to 8 years ago, when I started learning programming seriously. I was at that stage where I had heaps of cool game ideas, then I made super basic prototypes of each before losing motivation and moving on to another idea. None of them had any lasting effect. One of my ideas was for a project I called RopeQuest at the time. It was inspired by a GMTK video about Nintendo's philosophy of building games around their gameplay, a lesson which stuck to me to today. My idea was to have a platformer where the main character moves slowly and can't jump, but can throw ropes to swing on hooks, and this would be the main method of movement. When making the prototype, however, I couldn't figure out how to code the swinging. Yes, I was that bad at programming. So eventually, out of frustration, I wrote these 2 lines of code, which gave me this strange behavior. And I thought it was pretty cool, so I made a game based on it, called Polar. And in fact, this mechanic is so unique that I'm probably gonna reuse it sometime. But anyway, back to Fermatina. The RopeQuest idea simmered for a long time until I revived it as Kramening, a Nordic-themed platformer with more or less the same concept. However, the whole thing just never caught on to me. The world building felt lacking. I somehow couldn't bring myself to make some truly unique and interesting world design. I think I was unable to let go of the notion that the level design should look like a realistic landscape, even though, as games like Ori and the Will of the Wisps showed, the game can still feel super immersive even if the level design very clearly and obviously looks like level design for a video game. In fact, more inspiration came from Will of the Wisps, whose ending really left an impact on me. The cyclicness of the final scene inspired me to make Kramening's story also cyclical, but as I said, it just wasn't good enough for me yet. Later on, I made the game Mordant, starting from a small jam game and then expanding it into a commercial release, which is now free because it's pretty awful. I mean, the idea is fine, but the level design in no way promotes building creative traps. Every level can be beaten with just a single block or a spike. However, the music for Mordant, now that's a whole different story. It's just piano improvisations, but even from the first time I listened to tracks like Sunken Dungeon and Mordant Palace, I knew this was something big. Following the horrendous failure that was Mordant, I knew I had to reuse this music, along with other unreleased piano improvisations by misotanni. Finally, the gameplay. In 2019, I released a game called Wither, and it was the most proud I had ever been of a game before. It had a ridiculously simple premise. You shoot chains to pull yourself towards these hoops, placed around the world, and yet it was devilishly difficult and had quite a few unique strats, which I focused on in these secret areas, more on them later. However, it definitely didn't fully utilize the concept, left quite some room for improvement and fine detail in the gameplay itself, and the visuals, due to a game jam limiting me to 2 colors, were lacking and visually confusing at times. So the ideas brewed in my mind, they brewed and brewed. At first, I wanted to make a spiritual successor to Mordant called Fermata. Notice the pattern, music theory students? Where instead of killing individual archaeologists with traps, you'd manipulate their brains to make them not want to leave their planets, or the chemical content of their fuel to prevent them from doing so, or the position of other planets to prevent them from reaching them, all in the name of preventing a space-wide interspecies war. I actually did use this concept for the first Famicase I made back in 2019, but this idea still wasn't quite it. Then, on one train journey, it all clicked. I should combine all these half-based concepts for story and gameplay and music into one big masterpiece, Fermata in its final form. I started with planning since I didn't have access to my PC. I designed the world, planned where each of Mordant's tracks would play, and did some world building. I don't want to spoil too much yet, but let's just say the protagonist is a controversial character in its world, and it gets a bit philosophical, akin to the Talos Principle and its sequel, which I highly recommend by the way. I even planned out some names and a whole unique alphabet for this world, which you can see in-game. Originally, Fermata was meant to be a Metroidvania, but I soon realized that it would work a lot better as a Celeste-like linear game, with isolated levels that have a string of challenges each, since the most fun part of the gameplay is overcoming the creative challenges I create, and not backtracking and exploration. I'm still probably gonna put the levels on a world map, but apart from that, the game will be linear. Then I started programming. This is where I took special care in designing every little detail of the movement. For example, that you slow down at a slower rate when you're going at a high speed, or that you can't move in midair. Here's also where I implemented a few things differently from the original Wither. One big thing I added is movement on the ground. In Wither, there were a few places where you could get stuck in a position that made it impossible to progress, softlocks simply put, so that had to change. Another thing is how I treated deaths. Instead of respawning at a fixed position depending on what screen you're on, I just made the character respawn at the same place where it was last on the ground. This made the attempts more short-term, which is good for a rage game, as you don't have to repeat long sections. Another result of this change is the possibility of getting over it-esque level design. For example, in this section, if you fall down, you can't just kill yourself to get back to where you were before, you have to start again from the beginning. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. But, well, at least it makes my life easier because I don't have to manually add the respawn points. Finally, there was a cool little quirk I discovered while making Wither. If you try shooting a chain while inside a loop, you're instantly shot off in the direction of the center of the loop, which makes sense from a programming standpoint. I used this in one of these secret sections as a fun gimmick. However, for Fermata, I made it so that you shoot off in the direction of your cursor instead, because I think it gives the player more freedom and skill expression, and it allows for cool scenes like this. It's similar to the on-ground movement in a way, because that also allows the player to perfectly line up their trajectory of flinging. It's all about raising the skill ceiling and perfecting the conditions for the player to express their skill. Here I'll put in a small tangent about the character design. Why did I make it a chain ball instead of some kind of creature like in Wither? Well, going back to my original inspiration, i.e. Nintendo's design philosophy, I wanted to make it obvious what the character's abilities actually are. This creature doesn't really express flinging around on chains with its design, does it? It just seems kind of arbitrary. So instead I designed this protagonist. A ball made of chains that has a claw with which it can shoot chains from itself, and then probably has some mechanism inside of it that can quickly retract it. And it has an eye, so it can see, and so it looks at least somewhat visually appealing. Uh-oh, do you hear that? I think it's... no. Please no. No! Yeah, I'm not the biggest fan of level design, but it's a necessary evil. Even more so in a game like this, where basically the whole appeal is that I create unique challenges, which require creativity in terms of the game's mechanics to overcome. So, I got to work. My process was quite simple. I'd start by picking the size of the area I'm working on, based on these camera trigger objects. Then I'd choose the mini mechanic I want to experiment with. For example, in this area I teach the player the importance of early chain shooting, because if you shoot too late, you'll fall and die before your chain has a chance to reattach. Or in this one, I teach how shooting stops your movement in mid-air, something that was originally added to make aiming easier and more reliable, but, as most mechanics in this game, later used for wholly unique challenges. Later on, these mechanics become more and more niche, sliding after attaching a chain, rotating your chain while throwing it, and even things that are too complicated to explain. My hope is that the player gets a nice feeling of mastery over the mechanics by the end, and I think I've accomplished that by really pushing just how much content I made with this one mechanic. I also threw in some basic semi-meta progression in the form of keys and locks, and optional rifts to collect. Originally these were eggs, literal Easter eggs. After a few nights of level design, the pain was finally over, and I could get on with some visuals. I went with pixel art, kinda because it felt like the right choice, advancing from Wither's and Mordant's art style, but also because it's just something I'm good at. I also made my very own algorithm for automatically making the tiles for the level. I figured out a neat little trick to significantly decrease the number of tiles I need to draw. Normally I'd have to make 47 unique tiles to cover all possible combinations. However, if I decrease the visual tile size by half, I can use GameMaker's tileset options of rotation and mirroring to make all possible combinations with just 4 unique tiles. Plus some tiles for the platforms, which can also be rotated, and the spikes. Now obviously I'm not going to put in all of these by hand. I'll write a program to do it automatically, while also randomly flipping and choosing between several variations of the tiles to make it all appear random. The effect is honestly fantastic. And then for the background art, I just drew stuff that looked about right. I didn't really have the patience to perfect these. Especially for these huge structures, the microscopic detail doesn't really matter. It's the general effect that does. And I think these statues give off a pretty powerful effect. UI. No programmer likes making UI, but it has to be done at some point. I went with a super minimalist approach, both to make my life somewhat less painful, and because more complex menus really aren't necessary. I also went with my favorite way of making sliders, which also happens to be the laziest way, where you click on the menu option and just move your mouse left or right. One cool effect I did get to put in though was this fading in and out that I used for the logo and lore texts as well. It's actually a quite simple hack to an outline shader I got off the internet. Normally, the way an outline shader works is that for each pixel, it scans the pixels around it in a circle of increasing radius to see if there are any opaque pixels there. If so, it colors the original pixel with the outline color. My shader, instead of just checking if there are any opaque pixels, counts those opaque pixels to get a depth value for each pixel. Then, depending on a fading variable I put in, it makes all pixels with certain depth values disappear. Simple stuff. Normally that's where I'd end my UI talk, but actually there's one more important aspect. Since this is meant to be a big release in the future, it would be good if I added all the settings I'd like to have in the final version so that I can get more accurate feedback on the demo. So I quite carefully designed the settings, making sure to include accessibility settings wherever possible. This gave rise to the game speed slider, which I think is awesome. It removes the challenge of moving your mouse quickly and accurately to just leave the puzzle of what actions to actually use to get to your destination. Another sign of my endless genius is that you can increase the game speed above 100% if you want more challenge or a faster speedrun. Also, adding support for different refresh rates early on was a super vital decision, given that GameMaker games work with fixed frame rates only. It would be much more of a hassle to add that to a finished game. Finally, the support for screen scaling and window resizing is one of those things that distinguishes player-friendly games from developer-friendly ones. When it comes to sound effects, I rarely make anything myself. I'm just too lazy to rummage around to find something to make the sound I want. So I usually resort to free sound, and I did this time as well, though I'm always careful to only select Creative Commons 0 stuff, as that ensures that I can use it in a commercial project. Some minor sound editing, and they're ready to implement the game, with 2D audio panning and all that good stuff. Then some ambience made, as usual, from me blowing into a microphone. Pole stretched. And with a bit of reverb. The final effect sounded like this. There was one more auditory touch left, and that was the main menu music. I could just reuse Morden's menu music, but... no, it's just a bit too basic and MIDI sounding. So I remastered that track with a bunch of interesting ambiency instruments for the chords. I think it sounds much more fitting for a big release like this. The main menu also needed some kind of background, and a little planetary system was obviously the right choice given the thematics, which you don't know yet, but we'll get there. I made the planets with a noise texture and a special shader to clamp the brightness, render it as a circle, and make it appear lighter in the top left and darker on the outline. Then I just made the texture move to create the illusion of spinning, and made some smaller planets orbiting around the central one. Yeah, I know that's not how an actual solar system works. Then just a couple stars in the background and we're done. For a couple final touches, I added the speedrun timer, and I made the game keep track of other parameters. Deaths, hooks thrown, and even movements made on the ground. I thought it would be a cool challenge to try to beat the whole game without moving on the ground, which is actually possible. I tried it. And it's kinda like Celeste's winged golden strawberry, which you get by beating the first chapter without dashing. Finally, I also made a quick little Android version, because I thought it would be cool to play this on an actual touchscreen. And, well, it's not quite what I had in mind. Some of the more precise movements are harder to recreate on a phone compared to a computer mouse, but it's still pretty cool, I guess. And before publishing, I also had to make some promo materials, which was mostly screenshots and some gameplay footage. But I also made this cover art based on the opening scene of the game, so here's a quick time-lapse of that. And there you have it. Please check it out if it looks interesting. I'd appreciate it if you could tell me what I could improve on. I've already started work on the next level, which will have these swinging hooks, so look forward to more devlogs. Thanks for watching.